Story number 1. It was nearing midnight on a particularly chilly shift at the old rail yard where I worked as a security guard. The place was desolate, a relic from a busier era, now just rows of abandoned freight cars and rusted tracks. My job was straightforward: patrol the area, ensure no trespassers, and keep the peace. Yet there was an unnerving quality to the silence that settled over the yard at night. Around 2 a.m. during one of my routine rounds, I spotted a flicker of light between two freight cars. Curious, I approached, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I drew closer, the light vanished, replaced by the deep shadows that clung to the cold metal. That's when I heard it, the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps echoing off the steel. Someone was there, watching me. I called out, "Who's there? You need to leave. This property is private." There was no response, just the eerie creaking of the old rail cars swaying slightly in the wind. I tightened my grip on my flashlight, ready to use it if needed. The footsteps started again, this time moving towards me. Out of the shadows emerged a tall, thin man, his face obscured by the brim of an old hat. "I'm just passing through," he said, his voice low and gravelly. But something was menacing in his stance, something predatory in the way he blocked the only exit route I had. I noticed then the knife glinting in his hand, catching the weak moonlight. "But now that you've seen me, I can't let you go, can I?" Adrenaline surged through me as I realized the danger I was in. This was no ordinary trespasser. This was someone who didn't want to leave witnesses. "Look, there's no need for trouble," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You can still walk away from this." He laughed, a sound as cold as the steel surrounding us. "I don't think so," he said, stepping closer. The space was tight between the rail cars, and any attempt to run seemed futile. He lunged towards me, knife aimed at my chest. Instinctively, I sidestepped and swung my flashlight, hitting him on the side of his head. The impact sent him staggering back, disoriented. Seizing the moment, I sprinted towards the open yard, yelling into my radio for backup. I could hear him recovering and chasing after me, his footsteps pounding on the gravel. Just as he was about to catch up, headlights flooded the yard, the arrival of my backup scaring him off into the darkness. The rest of the night was a blur of police lights and statements. As I recounted the event to the officers, the reality of how close I had come to a different ending shook me deeply. The yard was never just a place of work after that night. It was a reminder of the fragility of life and the shadows that linger in forgotten places. Story number 2. The chill of the late autumn wind was noticeable even from inside my booth at the Starlight Burger drive-thru. The glow of the neon sign was a lonely beacon on the edge of town, where the highway turned into shaded woods. It was usually quiet this late, the clock nearing 2 a.m., and the distant sounds of wildlife were more company than I often had. That particular night, a thick fog rolled in, smothering the area in a dense, cold mist. It made the usual trickle of customers non-existent. I was settling in for a long night of solitude when a car's headlights finally pierced the fog, moving slowly toward the drive-thru. The vehicle, an old station wagon, had seen better days. It stopped at the order point, but no one spoke through the intercom. "Welcome to Starlight Burger. May I take your order?" I asked, receiving no response. I repeated myself, thinking maybe the intercom wasn't working. Still nothing. The car just sat there, engine idling softly. After a minute, curiosity overcame me, and I decided to use the exterior camera to get a better look. The driver was slumped over the wheel, unmoving. Panic set in as I debated what to do. Rushing out seemed risky and unsafe, but so did doing nothing. I decided to call emergency services. As I reached for the phone, the car door opened and the figure stirred. A man stepped out, disoriented and pale, staggering a few steps before collapsing onto the ground. I bolted from the booth, forgetting the phone, and ran to him. He was conscious, but barely, mumbling incoherently about needing help and someone else in the car. Glancing back, I noticed movement in the back seat. A child, it seemed, equally still. I shouted for help, though I knew no one would hear. The man grasped my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Please, help her. I can't..." He trailed off, consciousness slipping away. I looked back at the booth, the phone inside my only hope to get help quickly. Rushing back, I dialed 911, explaining the situation in hurried breaths. The operator assured me help was on the way. I ran back to the car, trying to comfort the child who was now softly crying, scared, but thankfully awake. The sirens of the ambulance cut through the fog minutes later, a sound I've never been so relieved to hear. The paramedics took over, reviving the man and ensuring the child was okay. It turned out to be a medical emergency, the man having suffered a severe diabetic shock. After the ambulance left, taking the man and the child to the hospital, the silence and fog returned, but the night felt fundamentally different. I was shaken, suddenly aware of how quickly things could turn from mundane to critical. The rest of my shifts were never quite the same, each car pulling up a reminder of the night I stepped out of the booth into the fog to help a stranger in need. Story number 3. It was supposed to be an easy job, just watching the Henderson kids while their parents enjoyed a night out in town. The Hendersons lived in an old Victorian house at the edge of our neighborhood, a sprawling place that was as charming as it was eerie, especially after sunset. I had babysat for them before, but never had I felt the unease that crept up on me that particular evening. As night fell, the house seemed to creak and sigh under the weight of its years. Tommy and Liz, the kids, were easy enough. They watched a movie and went to bed without a fuss. With the children asleep, I settled into the living room with a book. The only sounds were the whisper of turning pages and the occasional gust of wind against the windows. Around 11 p.m., the phone rang, shattering the silence. I answered it, expecting it to be Mr. or Mrs. Henderson checking in. Instead, there was a pause, followed by a heavy breath on the other end. "Check the children," a voice whispered before the line went dead. I froze, my heart pounding. It had to be a prank, I told myself, trying to shake off the fear. I decided to check on Tommy and Liz, telling myself that seeing them sleeping peacefully would calm my nerves. As I crept up the stairs, the old wood moaned beneath my feet. I opened the door to their room slowly, and to my relief, both children were sound asleep, just as I had left them. Trying to reassure myself, I headed back downstairs, but the phone rang again. This time, when I answered, the same eerie whisper came through. "Why? Haven't you checked the children?" Panic surged through me. I slammed the phone down and locked myself in the bathroom, dialing 911. The operator was calm, which helped steady my breathing. "We're tracing the call. Stay where you are," she instructed. Minutes later, the operator's voice returned, more urgent this time. "The calls are coming from inside the house. Help is on the way. Can you get to the children?" My heart stopped. Inside the house? I couldn't think. I could only react. I ran to the children's room, locked the door behind us, and gathered both kids into my arms, trying to shield them from whatever might happen. Police sirens filled the quiet night as flashing lights appeared through the window. It was the longest few minutes of my life before the officers came upstairs to tell us it was safe. They found an old, unused extension in the attic. Someone had been there, making the calls from inside the house. The aftermath was a blur of police officers and frightened children clinging to their returning parents. I went home shaken, unable to shake the image of that unassuming phone upstairs, a dormant threat hidden within a normal family home. Sleep didn't come easily after that night, and I never looked at babysitting the same way again. Story number 4. Working the graveyard shift at the Oakwood Inn, a lonely motel off a seldom-traveled interstate, always felt like a scene from an old horror movie. The inn was surrounded by dense woods, and its customers were mostly late-night travelers who rarely stayed more than a night. It was quiet, too quiet, and that night the stillness was unsettling. The clock had just struck 3 a.m. when a sudden thunderstorm broke the silence, the rain hammering against the roof and windows with ferocious intensity. Lightning illuminated the inn every few minutes, casting eerie shadows across the lobby. It was during one of these flashes that I saw her, a young woman standing outside, soaked to the bone, looking in through the front door. I hurried over to let her in, the bell jangling loudly as she entered. Her clothes were drenched, her hair plastered to her face, and she was shivering. "Can I get a room for the night?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," I replied, trying to give her a reassuring smile as I handed her the registration form. She scribbled something down quickly and handed it back. I didn't bother to read it. My main concern was getting her out of her wet clothes and into a warm room. I handed her the key to room 8, one of the rooms closest to the lobby. She thanked me and walked slowly down the corridor, her footsteps echoing softly. Once she was out of sight, I went back to my duties, though I kept an ear out for her in case she needed more towels or a blanket. About an hour passed when I heard a scream, a high-pitched, terrified scream that could only have come from her. I sprinted down the hallway to room 8, my heart pounding in my chest. I knocked frantically. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" There was no response, just silence. Then, a soft, whimpering sound from inside the room. Without hesitation, I used my master key to open the door. The room was dark, the only light coming from the bathroom. The air felt heavy, charged with a palpable sense of dread. "Hello?" I called out tentatively. Then I saw her, crouched in the corner of the room, her eyes wide with fear as she stared at something behind me. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing in the doorway, was a shadowy figure, its features obscured by darkness. Frozen with fear, I could only watch as it advanced toward us. The woman screamed again, snapping me out of my trance. I grabbed her hand, pulling her out of the room and down the hallway as fast as we could run. We didn't stop running until we reached the lobby. I locked the front door and called the police, my hands shaking uncontrollably. When they arrived, the storm had passed, and the room was empty, with no sign of any intruder. The woman was too shaken to speak, and I could hardly explain what I had seen. After that night, the Oakwood Inn felt different, and I could never bring myself to go to room 8 again. The whole experience was a chilling reminder that some nights at the Oakwood Inn, you weren't alone. Story number 5. The job as a night janitor at the local museum was supposed to be a quiet one. The museum, housed in a grand old mansion on the edge of town, was filled with artifacts from the town's colonial past. My duties were simple: clean the floors, dust the exhibits, and make sure everything was tidy for the next day's visitors. I'd always enjoyed the stillness of the night shift, the way the echoes of my mop and bucket seemed to mingle with whispers of history. However, one particular night changed my view of those quiet hours. It was a little past midnight, and a thunderstorm was rolling in. its distant rumbles complementing the eerie tick-tock of the ancient grandfather clock in the main hall. As I moved through the dimly lit corridors, the storm outside grew fiercer, casting strange shadows against the museum walls. Lightning flashed, and for a moment, the entire building was illuminated in a stark, ghostly light. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing at the end of the hall near the Revolutionary War exhibit. Assuming it was a lost tourist or a kid on a dare, I called out, "We're closed, you'll need to leave." The figure didn't move or respond. I approached cautiously, the air around me growing inexplicably colder. As I got closer, I realized with a start that the figure was one of the mannequins from the exhibit, dressed in an authentic 18th century uniform. Laughing nervously at my tension, I reached out to adjust its position, but as I touched its arm, it felt unnaturally warm. Thunder clapped loudly, startling me, and in that split second, the mannequin's head turned towards me, its eyes seeming to meet mine. Panic gripped me, and I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I convinced myself it was just the storm playing tricks, a burst of nerves from the thunder. But as I turned to leave, I heard the sound of footsteps following me. Quick, heavy steps that seemed too real, too urgent. I spun around, flashlight beam darting wildly, only to see the hallway empty. My mind raced, terror mounting. I decided to head for the security office, needing the reassurance of a locked door and a working phone. As I hurried through the exhibits, the footsteps echoed behind me, always just out of sight. Reaching the security office, I slammed the door shut and locked it. I grabbed the radio, calling for the night security guard, but static was the only reply. The footsteps stopped outside the door, and all was silent save for my ragged breathing. Minutes passed, each one stretching endlessly until the footsteps slowly receded. The rest of the night, I stayed in the office and kept the door firmly locked. When dawn finally broke, bringing normalcy with its light, I ventured out. The museum was exactly as I had left it, untouched and silent. Nothing was out of place, and the mannequin was back in its original pose. I never spoke of that night, and I finished my duties during the daylight hours from then on. The museum remained a place of history and learning, but for me, it was also a reminder that some nights hold more than just shadows. They hold the echoes of the past, walking just behind us.